Hey everyone, I'd like to talk about the first time that I drove across the country. I usually don't make videos like this or at all, but it's not something that a lot of people get to do, and I was fortunate enough to do this twice. This is something that I definitely like to share. I drove from coast to coast from Clifton, New Jersey to Seattle, Washington, over the course of 6 days, 48 hours on the road, and about 3,000 miles put together. Now, I've had some problems during this trip, but nothing too major. It was definitely something that changed my life and my perception of this amazing country, and I think it made me a more experienced traveler as well. I started driving on June 10th in 2018, starting from my house. My car is a 2006 Scion TC with about 153,000 miles at that time. I'd always been warned that this car was never going to make it. I was never going to get past Illinois, but to me it was the best and cheapest option to get to Seattle. So I had this car for 8 years. It was dependable. I've trusted it with my life, and I still do. And during my last service, my longtime mechanic informed me that this car can make it there, but he was not sure that it was going to make it back. So at this time, I still didn't know if this car would make it back to New Jersey if it ever had to. So let's start with day one. I went through New Jersey and Pennsylvania, very routine. I've been through most of Pennsylvania before, but my first destination was Ohio, specifically the Travel Inn in Perrysburg, just southeast of Toledo. Straight up, this was a trucker motel. Aside from the highway, it was just in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by farms and truck stop amenities on all sides. I pulled in, checked in, and parked my car by the room to unload my things, and it turned out I was in the wrong spot because this guy from Texas in a red pickup pulling a trailer tried telling me that I had to move my car, and I say trying because he really didn't do a good job of getting his point across. He had a really thick accent, and it took me a bit to understand what he was saying. Now, also, it didn't help because he prefaced this by asking me where my room was. Now, that was just pretty creepy, it's like the first day of the trip, I'm already, getting sketched out. That wasn't good, and the room did not help either. But the only reason I was there was because it was a budget motel and I was on a budget. As you'll learn throughout this video, I'm going to be explaining how, picking the budget hotels is probably not the greatest idea, but it's whatever. It was a trucker motel, a budget, it didn't have high expectations. There were a few dead bugs, the room smelled like smoke, but at least the Wi-Fi worked because I was still applying to jobs. I didn't have a job there. When I was in Seattle, I got a job within a week, but I was still going through 5 to 10 positions every night. So I've been driving all day. It was time to get food. I don't want to go out and drive again. I ordered something, and since I was in the middle of nowhere and all and surrounded by farmland, I opened the door and there were just so many bugs on the door. I've never seen this in my life. I used to go to Florida all the time as a kid. I've never seen that many bugs in my life. I don't really get that in the suburbs of New Jersey. Door was just covered in them, so made a point not to open it all that much. So during this time, I realized just how vast and flat the Midwest is. And I'm just barely at the edge of Ohio, and it already feels like I'm in a whole different world. There's no mountains, there's not a lot of traffic lights in these rural farming communities. It's just this empty four-way intersection with farmland on all sides on a road that might as well be a dirt road. I remember going to bed with the sound of Route 90 nearby. So let's go on to day two. The plan here was to get to Iowa, specifically the Economy Inn in Stuart, Iowa. Stuart is located in the heart of Iowa, several miles west of Des Moines off Route 90. Just like the previous day, this place was in the middle of nowhere, but it was just the most I could drive, It was the most unnerving day of the trip, because just as I was an hour away from the motel, I heard this grinding, clicking sound come from under the car. Now, I've heard this sound before when I got stuck with my friend in college. His car started clicking before coming to a stop, and the problem was eventually the alternator. If your alternator goes, you're going to have a problem. So that was my worst fear, but luckily that was not it. I stopped at a gas station and just kind of checked the front of my car. I don't know what I was looking for, just any signs, and I noticed that my splash shield started coming off. Now, the grinding sound was probably the splash shield hitting the road, or worse, my tires. So I stopped in that store, got some duct tape, and carried on. I'd have to turn off the music once in a while just to hear if the sound would come back, in which case it's time to pull off again. Now, I brought some pretty bad duct tape, so I had to do this several times on the trip before finding the perfect roll of duct tape the next day down in Colorado. I think it was the constant wind at like 70 plus miles per hour hitting the shield in the opposite direction that like started loosening it and eventually coming off. Now, I still have problems with this to this day. I didn't get this fixed. But luckily, nothing mechanical was wrong. Now, one thing you see a lot of in this country, other than the flat land, is the pivot irrigation systems. These things look like giant caterpillars, and they could be like hundreds of feet long. They're just moved across miles of farmland for irrigation. And I really do think of most of this country as a giant farm, especially a state like Iowa. Iowa definitely fits that description, but it was way more greener and way more hilly than I expected. There are obviously no mountains here. I haven't seen mountains since Pennsylvania, but there's still a dynamic landscape, and I saw miles and miles of windmills. Iowa is doing fantastic things for wind power, and I do think they should keep it up, rightfully so, for the amount of wind that it can generate on its farms. So I did experience some traffic around noon on this day as I got through Chicago, but I've never seen so many trucks in one place on this huge highway that looked like the heart of Midwest industry, like the biggest highway interchange I've ever seen, and I've spent most of my life living around New York. So it was pretty intimidating. There are way more trucks than cars here. You really couldn't see where you were going because you were boxed in, but generally the slower traffic kind of made it easier to change lanes and all. Usually truck drivers, if they're good truck drivers, they'll stay a close distance. They won't be tailgating anyone, so you can just weave in and out of them, no problem. So when I did get to the hotel, I'm still worried about my splash shield, but it was such an upgrade from the previous day. This motel had a more rustic style, and it was so much cleaner. The Wi-Fi was fine, so I can still do my grad school work. I was essentially staying on a farm as well, just like Ohio the day before. You know, after the parking lot, you could just see miles and miles of flat farmland. It's another trucker hotel, but not a lot of trucks were staying here, just some semis that were parked near the Phillips 66 gas station. I learned at this time that places in the Midwest really like calling streets Division Street. I don't see a lot of that back home. Just like in Ohio, it was pretty gross to see the amount of bugs here. It was really, really warm and sunny on these days, so they were definitely out. I started noticing that they were piling up on my windshield, and I had to start washing my windshield every time I stopped for fuel. But honestly, my main worry was that a lot of them would get inside my car. As this turned out, this was not the case as far as I knew. But I don't know, maybe there were a bunch of them in there. I think I'd be more comforted actually seeing bugs inside so that I know they're there, other than me just kind of wondering if they're there. So I was closer to Route 80 than the day before. It was generally easy to get back on the highways here because there's nothing. You don't have to travel a lot. There's a highway, and then there's like a little exit going off to like one main street. And that's what most of the places in the Midwest are like, the rural Midwest. But when I woke up, I felt refreshed, and I would feel refreshed every day of this trip. Driving for 8 or 9 hours, combined with stops, maybe 10 to 11 hours, it could really take its toll on you. But you just stretch regularly, you rest well and eat well, and the next day you'll feel like it never happened, and you're ready to go to the next state. So I went outside at night to look at the stars, but this didn't last long because of the bugs again. But it was a nice experience overall, just to be away from the city, to be surrounded by nothing, see like total darkness in any direction. Much better and more refreshing than what I was used to my whole life. Now, just as a side note here, whenever I showed my ID at the hotel check-in, the first response was always, "Wow, New Jersey, you're a far way from home," and it would just get worse the farther I go from home. Later on in Idaho, the woman at the front desk told me that she's never met someone from New Jersey. Now, that's kind of weird because, one, we're everywhere, and two, the job that I eventually had, I met people from all over the US and all over the world. I've probably talked to at least one person from every state in this country when I was working there. But I guess being in the dead center of Iowa or Idaho, you know, you don't get many New Jersey travelers when you're just a small hotel in farmland out of many just like you. Another point that came up a lot during this trip is that there's no such thing as a flyover state. I don't believe that. It's just a state that people don't know enough about to explore and to appreciate. So don't get me wrong, I wouldn't live in Iowa, even if I was given like 2 acres of property for free, but I do have to appreciate the miles of prairies and the grasslands and how huge the sky looks without concrete and mountains everywhere. You know, this scenery doesn't mean much to a lot of people, but I think it's something different, and the point of traveling like this is to experience something different. So day 3. Today's agenda was Iowa to Denver, Colorado. Well, it was just a suburb outside of Denver called Greenwood Village. I originally wanted to stay at this cheaper place, but I had to change plans due to the reputation that it had. Obviously, hotels should have some sort of security, but there was an actual police car stationed at my previous choice, so I decided it was time to change. Remember, budget isn't always better. This was the longest day at over 9 hours and 642 miles. I had to pass through half of Iowa, all of Nebraska, and a good amount of Colorado. This issue is going to come up again in Montana and Idaho, but you really don't want to stay at these hotels unless you absolutely have to. Traveling on a budget is great, but you've got to have some money to spare in case something does go wrong with your car if you need to change hotels. Luckily, I canceled far enough in advance and I had a refund, but going forward with the actual trip, Nebraska was an unexpected experience. You always hear about how it's flat and there's nothing there, but that was half true. It was quite rural and empty, but the landscape was grassy and hilly just like Iowa. I saw Omaha as I crossed the Missouri River between Council Bluffs, Iowa, and onto Nebraska. This was the second time I really experienced traffic on this trip, but again, it was nothing major. It was actually a refreshing change of scenery, too. I stopped at a rest stop in Gretna, Nebraska, to see the city go back into the hills and valleys of Nebraska farmland. It was a difficult day driving-wise. It was the longest drive, and it was the most time I've spent in one state. Back east, you always look forward to getting to the next state, and it boosts morale just a little bit. But Nebraska just kept going on. It was almost the whole day in Nebraska. So Colorado was like a light at the end of a long Nebraska tunnel. Also, when you do live in the Northeast, you can see like 6 or 7 states in a day. So just spending all those hours in one state was kind of not fun. I did get to Colorado in the afternoon, and I crossed over into Mountain Time. It was a big accomplishment to get here, because Denver marked the halfway point in terms of miles, and I guess driving time too. So when I got to Colorado, it was another change of scenery. Not as much as before, but it did look like just this rugged wilderness, like actual cowboy country. The words "welcome to colorful Colorado" were pretty accurate. I'm sorry, let me try that again. The words "welcome to colorful Colorado," that's a tongue twister. The words "welcome to colorful Colorado" were pretty accurate. Around this time, I was welcomed to the state by my friends who lived there, and I was invited over for a bit. This didn't happen for logistic reasons, but it was a nice invitation, and it would have been cool to see them. It was just kind of coincidental that I changed hotels without thinking, and I ended up a mile away from them at Denver's Tech Center in Greenwood Village. This was probably the nicest place to stay at least so far. A Motel 6 with multiple floors, nice amenities. For the first time on the trip, this was not just a trucker hotel. The weirdest thing I've noticed about Denver was it was not what I pictured it to be. I was there in the late spring, yes, almost summer, but I always pictured like snowy mountains and a more blue feeling. Instead, it was more like a borderline desert. Lots of orange shades over the mountains, and lots of smog too. I've flown into Denver before. It wasn't my first time there, so I should have known, but it just didn't feel like Denver, Colorado. But regardless, this was a very special place to be, and I would have loved to see more of it for sure. Okay, we're getting on to day 4 now. I started day 4 by buying new duct tape at a local repair store. I kept waking up earlier and earlier the more the trip went on. I believe in Iowa I slept an hour later than I wanted, but I was ready to get to Montana from my halfway point. And Montana was just a dream, so I was really motivated to do this. I got to the store, I brought stronger tape to ensure that, the splash shield issue would not happen again. So since this town is located right near Littleton, I wanted to visit the Columbine Memorial and Cemetery. Now, this isn't really something that you want to do. It's something that I felt obligated to, what in the wake of all this gun violence going on all over this country. I just feel like, you kind of have to see a consequence of it for it to feel real to you and to feel like a serious issue. So it was really a tragedy and a formative one for most of our young lives, us students who grew up in the late 1990s, the early 2000s. It's not like school shootings today that are usually forgotten about relatively quickly. This memorial is a reminder that after nearly 20 years, there's still so much that has not changed from this tragedy that should have never happened again. There is a section dedicated specifically to some of the victims and the family members of the students and the teacher who died on that day. It's a reminder that this tragedy was real. These people are no longer with us. They should have been going to college, living out their lives, not having to worry about this happening to their children. I had driven past Columbine High School on the way back to the highway as well. I had another car problem on the way to Wyoming and eventually Montana. This wasn't actually a big deal. The problem also hit me. It was a truck that picked up a rock and left a dent in my passenger side windshield. Now, I'm surprised that this didn't happen more frequently, but, you know, it wasn't a huge concern to fix. It's still there to this day. I didn't really have a problem with it. The duct tape was really working for my splash shield, though, since I didn't have to do that since. I was still excited to get to Wyoming. That's a new state for me. And I also made plans to visit my friend up in Sheridan, not too far from the Montana border. So later in the day would have been great. Wyoming was probably the most empty and terrifying state to drive in. Absolutely. It is the least populated state also. So I also had to plan carefully because you can go 30 or 40 miles without seeing anything in any direction except for occasional farmhouses. I mean, there were hardly any exits that led to anywhere other than small homes. To make things worse, I was actually expecting a call for a phone interview. And I wish I could have pulled over at a gas station for that, but I messed up. I was still racing against time to try and find a gas station. But instead I pulled over onto one of these makeshift exits. It's not really an exit, it's more like a ramp that you pull off on. And I took the call. My other concern was not having service, so it was a huge surprise that I did. So that goes into planning as well. You know, you don't want to get below half a tank anywhere in the country. You know, because if you're going like 40 miles and you only have like 40 miles of gas left, you don't want to make things that close. You don't want to cut it too closely. The other thing I noticed about Wyoming was just how windy it was. Every time I'd stop for food or fuel, there was a very strong wind kicking up large dirt and dust around me. It was difficult to focus. It was just so distracting. But Wyoming was truly something beautiful. Something totally special with its plateaus and its gorgeous mountains. I can't imagine navigating this state in winter, though. It was just empty. If I ran into a problem, like, who would find me? Who could I call for help if I didn't have cell service? Especially if I ran out of gas, you know, what can I do? It was mostly cloudy at some points, and I was looking out for tornadoes. This could sound totally stupid, and I don't know if there are tornadoes in Wyoming, but that's just the vibe that I was getting. But it looked like a storm could happen any moment. It was really one of the most haunting days of the trip. Actually, no, I'll go as far as to say it was the most haunting day of the trip. So after I met with my friend in Sheridan, I was about 2 hours away from my final destination in Billings, Montana. I stayed at a Billings Motel 6, but the important thing is to stay at Billings North. If you're ever going through Billings and you want a hotel to stay at, you gotta go to Billings North. This is where we go back to talking about picking the right hotel. I booked this one in advance, so I knew what I was paying, but many travelers may not do this. They may just stop whenever they want to. I remember I paid like over $50 for this room for the night, but the guy in front of me didn't have a reservation. He had to pay over $100, double my price. So, I actually don't understand not booking a hotel in advance. You know, don't you want to know what you're paying? Because otherwise, if you stop, you're either running around looking for the cheapest hotel, which is pretty, like, you know, not the right idea. Like, what happens if you go through 5 hotels and you notice the first one was the cheapest to stay at? You know, so I just think it's so much better to just book your hotel in advance and know where you're staying. You know, I could have been in this position if I had chosen Billings South. My friends chose this location when they came here, and they warned me about it. They left after about 20 minutes, and I don't even think they got their refund back. Many hotels offer this grace period for you to see the room and then leave with a refund if it's not up to your quality, And you should definitely read the fine print there to make sure that you do have a grace period, or at least you have an exit plan, like you can get a refund or something. Don't even start unloading your stuff yet. Get into the room, check to see if there are any red flags, see if the water's working, if it runs hot, all the outlets, and then look closer around the corners and the beds. Are there any dead bugs there? Does it smell moldy or smoky? Is the water running hot? Do the plugs work? Does it have Wi-Fi if you need it? You should take about like 10 to 15 minutes doing this so that you don't run into no refund territory, again, depending on the hotel's policy. But overall, Montana was just a dream come true. It was a state I was looking forward to most, and I did see a good amount of it. This is where you start entering the real mountain territory as you cross the Continental Divide into the Rockies. Now, this state is nicknamed Big Sky Country, and that's definitely true. The open spaces and the wilderness in Montana and the Yellowstone region are a unique treasure in this country that definitely should not go unnoticed. Again, there's no such thing as a flyover state. If you think that there is, you're going to miss out on a lot. I don't even like fishing, but for some reason I wanted to go fly fishing in Montana, or like skiing or something. I don't even ski. But as for settling down for the night, I went out to pick up food for once, and it was fairly easy to drive around except for like the road was under construction for like 0.3 miles out of the hotel. I drove on rocks, just waiting for one of them to pierce my tire because that's exactly what I need. Or like any stray nails or something. Again, this is like a construction site, so that stuff happens. The car was doing fine though. I had 2 days left. My morale was really only growing. Fun fact about this day is that it was both the hottest and the coldest day of the trip. In Colorado, it was well over 90 degrees. It was scorching hot. I couldn't drive with the windows down anymore. When I got to Montana, I had to start putting a jacket on because it was in the 50s. I felt the middle of summer and the middle of autumn in the same day. So this isn't totally strange for someone from New Jersey because this happens to us a lot, all year round really, and that's without traveling 600 miles. Let's head on to day 5. So on day 5, I set out to see the rest of Montana and eventually Idaho. This is the day that I crossed the Continental Divide. When you enter Idaho, you are officially in Pacific Time and the Pacific Northwest. The landscape changed again when I saw these dense, towering pine trees near the Idaho border and Lookout Pass, almost 5,000 feet in elevation. I remember that this mountain pass was fairly precarious. It was a pretty rainy day too, nothing heavy, but still that Pacific Northwest rain you hear so much about, still something to make someone worry when they're going down all those steep hills at highway speed. My first plan was to stay at the Trail Inn in Kellogg, right near the Montana border. But this had to change. Right when I got there, I started noticing that this was a pretty dirty room. I checked my oil, I stayed for about 30 minutes in total, and I told the front desk. The woman that worked there was very understanding and accommodating. I was given a refund without question. I said, it's all right. Perhaps it was a bad day for housekeeping. I'm not a horrible customer at all. I'm not a mean customer. I don't yell at people for things that are out of their control. Even if it is their control, I'm just a nice millennial that understands what it's like to work in these professions, so I just don't give anyone a hard time. So it was a nice place for whoever can tolerate that, though. My other problem was that my laptop was dead. It was completely dead, and being a student on the road in summer classes, trying to apply for jobs, I needed my laptop every day. So my second reason for leaving was that there was a Best Buy 35 miles away in Coeur d'Alene. The Idaho Panhandle is really small, so I knew that I can make it. I mean, the Panhandle is like 60 miles across or something like that. You go in and out of the Panhandle in about under an hour. Plus, I would be closer to Seattle the next day, just across the Spokane River from Washington. I took the small amount of stuff that I brought in, and I continued on to Coeur d'Alene. This hotel was another Motel 6. Since I learned my lesson about picking the really low-budget hotels, I learned my lesson about 3 times. Wait, how many days has it been? I've probably learned my lesson every single day of this trip, to be honest with you. But the problem here was more about the people. I spent half the time learning about my new laptop and how to navigate it, but the other half was spent trying to do laundry. There was this older teen who started a wash cycle while I was there, but he left his clothes in the dryer for like 2 hours. I kept checking back again and again, and it's a universal truth. that when you have a lot of people, especially strangers, sharing a washing machine, there's always going to be one person that does this. They're always going to forget that it's there because they don't care about you. They're really horrible people. Don't be that kind of person, please. I mean, I can rant about this kid walking around the hotel in his pajamas, so I don't think he's doing anything important. I don't think he's, like, preparing for, like, a business meeting or anything like that. I don't think he was up to anything. Okay, but unexpectedly, on my last checkup, there were these people in the room. They told me that they put my clothes in the dryer after the kid came back, and they paid like $1.25 for that same reason. You know, they had a dryer too, and they technically didn't have to do this. Plus, I told them that I was coming back, but it was a really nice thing to do to make up for that kid who was wasting everybody's time for a couple of hours. That's right, you're getting called out on this video so many times, and I hope you're just doing really badly in life right now. Everyone knows who you are. Overall, Idaho was distinguished by my entrance into the Pacific Northwest. The worst part of the trip was over. I only had 5 hours left until Seattle, and this is mostly crossing through Washington territory, since Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, is essentially on the border. Day 6, this is going to be my last day. I wake up the earliest when it's still dark. I fueled up one more time to take advantage of the low fuel prices, and I set out across the Spokane River into Spokane, Washington. While it's true that I was in Washington really soon, this is a very large state, and I had some time to get to Seattle. I think Washington has to be like 5 or 6 hours across, because that peninsula goes all the way out there. The terrain was incredible. I've never seen anything like it, and I really didn't expect to see something like this. These light yellow sandy beaches at the feet of dark mountains, pure blue water, steep mountain passes, and the most intimidating pass was probably the Snoqualmie Pass, just an hour from Seattle, an hour east. I don't know directions, but I really should not have made that mistake. But the Snoqualmie Pass, with an elevation of 3,000 feet, this pass is pretty dangerous in winter or even in wet conditions. But luckily I had a dry day. You know, Seattle doesn't get that much rain in June, since the rainy season is from October to April. But needless to say, you need to have chains on your cars if you're attempting to drive this pass in a snowstorm. There are different levels of advisories here. There are traction tires advised, there are no traction tires needed, or there are traction tires required. Meaning, I guess you can technically go through the pass if you don't get pulled over. You know, who's going to pull you over in a snowstorm? But you don't want to. So if you do drive in like eastern Washington during winter, you're probably going to want to have some snow tires on you. I started to see Seattle as I came through Mercer Island on Route 90. I'd only been to Seattle twice before, most recently a month before I arrived again, but it felt like home. I didn't see Mount Rainier on the way here due to all of the other mountains in the way, but I did get to see the Columbia Tower and the Space Needle, the rest of the city. You know, this highway is pretty big. It's pretty high up when you finally get onto I-5, so you're just weaving through these buildings, and you're like several stories in the air, so that's pretty cool. As I got off the highway, I started to go down these really steep hills toward Puget Sound. You're going west, you're going down the hills, and I was on my way to my friend's apartment. I noticed that my oil light was on, it started blinking, and that's not a good sign. You should never let your oil light turn on. You shouldn't let it get to that point. I was supposed to check it in Montana, but I forgot, so I did it the day before in Idaho. It seemed fine, but it wasn't. Moral of the story is to check if you're not sure. You're probably going to need some after 2,000 miles, you know, depending on how it burns, but I just got an oil change within the week before heading out, and I still needed oil after this trip. So a car like mine, you're thinking like around 3,000 miles, you can't go without filling up your oil. To summarize this, in as few words as possible, 2 paragraphs, taking a trip across the country, a drive across the country, is a formative experience. It's something that you absolutely should do if you ever get the chance, and you should definitely make time and save up to have that chance. You will see the most incredible landscapes like you've never seen before. This can change your perspective about how big this country is, how different this country is, and how you can watch it change multiple times per day. It doesn't sound interesting to drive through 2,000 miles of farmland, but it really is worth it. You know when you fly over the middle of the country and you just see these green and tan circles and squares below, and you realize that's what most of this country actually looks like when you get away from the coasts. There's certainly a lot more to say about this, but for one trip, sticking with one route is good, depending on how much time and money you have. I took one of the, not the most direct routes actually. I went to Denver and then I went up through Wyoming and Montana. It was only like 4 hours longer, but I still really wanted to see states like Wyoming and Colorado from the ground for once. So get out there, save up, and see what you can discover. It's a beautiful country. It's an amazing country. It's going to change your life. I don't think anyone in history has ever regretted going on a cross-country drive. So whenever you're ready, it's going to be one of the best and one of the most exciting things you'll ever do. So thank you for watching this. I hope I've helped prepare you guys for some of you to do this. I really think it's something you should take advantage of, and I hope I helped. So thank you guys again. Have a great rest of your day.